Well, how about that then, eh? We got some unusual winners, didn't we? But unfortunately, as you can imagine, Chuck ain't one of them, cause, well, you know. After the airbender known as Charles Leclerc had it so the wind conspired against the McLaren in qualifying, their landmark 200th victory came the hard way, through the art of strategy, giving Lando Norris the win. Now, before you get up your ladder on your own, I'm not saying that Lando was given the win, no. It was very much a case of Lando pretty much didn't have many options, they went for the long shot, and it paid off. Because he still had to keep the car on the road and try not to punch air like he was trying to do in Spa, and he managed to actually convert it into yet another win, his third in 4 races. Because he did have to ultimately make the call in which to try and get somewhere after having a really mardy start, falling behind not only Fernando Alonso, but also a George Russell, which is in the case reminding us of what happened in Bahrain. But fortunately for Lando fans, he wasn't stuck behind them for very long, and then eventually he was in contention for the win, which he ultimately got. But seriously, I think Lando and the other frontrunners weren't expecting Alonso to be right there, and he was going ghost, quite frankly, and doing what he was doing best at Monaco 2021. And I was really shocked at that at the time, but then I remembered that many people throughout the entire weekend were saying, oh, the Hungaroring is just like Monaco without the walls, so no wonder Fernando was able to do what he was able to do a few years ago. But yeah, once he was in clear air, there were no errors to be had. Even though he had a rampaging Oscar Piastri coming his way, he was able to keep it together and therefore be able to get back within single figures again in the championship going into the summer break. And what is the race that we come back to at the end of August? Zandvoort, where he had an absolute barnstormer there, winning by over 20 seconds when Oscar was nowhere. That'll be a very good track for him to come back to after he is now heading into the summer break with yet another victory. And especially at a track which doesn't have the best of memories in recent times. That's certainly been a redemption arc in of itself for him. And as for Oscar Piastri, he did the best he could in trying to shadow Charles Leclerc's attempt at a two-stopper, which, as many people suspected, was going to be the conventional strategy, given how it can be unforgiving on tyres this particular track. But then, due to the temperatures being a little bit cooler than expected, it was certainly a lot cooler than it was when I was knocking around that track. I caught the sun even though I wasn't looking at the sun. It meant that some cars were afforded a little bit more pace, and then the harder tyres were able to last that little bit longer, which meant the one stop was actually valid. Then having to try and do yet another dive bomb, which he said he wouldn't do after Austria, but then ultimately did, it meant that he was then having to look right behind Norris's diffuser again. But the difference between this race and Spa is that Lando was under pressure, and he didn't succumb. And Andrea Stella ultimately called that entire encounter yet another 1-2 as firm but fair, which quite honestly I would say is perfectly accurate. Oh yeah, the call to force Ferrari stopping earlier than ideal, that was good. Shows you can be dominant and your drivers not hate each other. It's certainly a welcome sight, I would imagine, and I think many people will start to forget what happened last year and now think about what happened this year. But I'll tell you one thing that is very much at the forefront of our minds, mine especially, Gabi, my other boy. In fact, I think we've just got to pull this one out of the bag. Brazil. 8 points in one go? He goes and more and doubles his tally. He's now in the mix with all of the other midfield drivers with 14 points. 14! This has got to be the drive of his fledgling career. On merit, no rain getting in the way to make it out to be a fluke in a Sauber as well. And then the meat inside a multiple world champion sandwich. Alonso ahead of him and Verstappen behind him, and he didn't put a foot wrong. And let's not forget, 5th place at one point, he was within DRS, he could have taken Fernando, but Alonso, his manager, was not going to make it easy for him. So you could easily imagine that both he and Max are going to be congratulating the Brazilian after the race, and, well, no, they already have, because this kid has definitely got something. I told you to let Gabi cook. He's cooking Michelin star quality food right here. Although I am not going to lie, I did have a bit of a squeaky bum moment when he was flagged for a start line issue and Hülkenberg was, but then Hülkenberg got the penalty and then Gabriel didn't. I was so relieved about that, but I'm just proving to you that's the weekly effect, that they were able to talk it down. Because usually when you get those sort of notifications, as Martin Brundle would say, oh, that's a slam dunk. Well, it wasn't a slam dunk in this case. He just kept the pace. And no wonder he got the driver of the day in front of Fernando. People are starting to see that this guy is the real deal. Now, about Alonso and Stroll. 5th and 7th may sound a bit ho-hum for some teams, but this was Aston's most competitive weekend of the year, and they didn't need any rain to help them out at all. Especially, look at what Fernando had to come back from at the beginning of the weekend, where he had back issues, and then the only issue that he had was that he couldn't try for 4th place, and that, he had to settle for only 10 points. And then Lance Stroll, he gets a 7th place. Yeah, he did get mugged by a couple of people at the start, but I don't think he's going to care. I don't think Aston's going to care. 16 points in one race has brought Aston Martin right back into the mix, and now within 20 points of getting back into 5th place in the Constructors for a 3rd year in a row. That is wild, considering where they were back in Belgium. Now, I'm going to get my spanner out, because I've heard many people talk about that, the reason why they were so bad in Spa was because they brought the wrong floor, like it was an Australia spec one, logistics issue. Well, I've not really heard that being confirmed, and that the team is mainly saying, well, the track just suits our car really, really well. And then you got to remember what Fernando was able to do in one of the worst McLarens in its history in getting the fastest lap. So, it's Fernando we're talking about here. That front wing upgrade with then an older spec floor, which they then do all that Jenga stuff, mixing and matching, and they've got a good package, has done something. Newey has had very much another little bit of a lunchtime conversation. Even if he's not doing any active involvement, there's something to this AMR 25 now. Because it's come alive after the Spa slump, and now it's able to do what many of the other teams were able to do, and perfectly enact a one-stop strategy, and keep their drivers in the positions they ultimately found themselves in after the start. This is amazing from this team, and very much needed. And for people counting regarding the battle between Fernando and Lance at the points, this now means they're both equal with 26 points each. So 52 for Aston Martin, they're now in 6th, 1 point ahead of Sauber. So back to Bortoleto, he's keeping Sauber in the hunt still, whilst Hülkenberg is not having a great time of it. We'll talk about that in the loser sections because yes, Nico is unfortunately a loser. But another winner we need to discuss is the likes of George Russell, because you might be thinking, well, how is he a winner? Well, yet another podium, without many people paying attention. And then in the case of, blimey, he just turned into me, we're now looking at what happened between he and Charles and going like, yeah, George, you're right. He did turn into you. But it was so dramatically engaging. I loved it. And priceless. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Wrong sponsor. That's McLaren. In any case, Russell's first podium since Canada owed plenty to opportunism and handy starts. He mugged Norris, as per. He was able to match Ferrari's earlier pace, and then pulled off said move on Charles to eventually get past the driver and break away by nigh on 20 seconds. Albeit 5 of them courtesy of the stewards. I would chalk this particular Grand Prix up as a combination of the W16 liking the cooler climates, which unfortunately does show the Mercedes team is very much in the whims and the wants of the weather, and also to the fact that George Russell is just there in that particular moment, just somewhere in between Ferrari and McLaren, not really figuring with McLaren because they have not really got much of a leg to stand on between those two, but they are very much in the hunt when the conditions are right for the picking. That George can just whistle in there and you just go, well, how did he get there? Mercedes' decision to revert to an older specification of suspension did the trick. But I'll tell you one person who isn't floundering, and that is yet again Liam Lawson. He's back in the winner's circle whilst his teammate had a very unfortunate malady befall him. It's quite safe to say now that the Kiwi is quietly building a reputation as one of the midfield's most economical racers, and a case for him to remain in the sport for next year since, well, he's only 2 points shy of Hadjar now, after being for the longest time having no points at all. Because he had a pretty sharp getaway for a while, and yes, he did get mugged eventually by Verstappen, but that was to be expected. And also rather smart given my Red Bull hierarchy, and Max Verstappen on the hunt to try and get back into the top 5, it would be very wise for Liam to allow him to do his thing. But then come later in the race, all of the pieces came into a specific position where Liam ultimately was the leading Red Bull Group driver. Again. Yes, it's not the 6th place he got in Austria, but it's yet another 4 points to his name, which yet again is capitalising on the fact that Isack Hadjar is having a bit of a unfortunate mid-season spell like Kimi Antonelli has been. It doesn't detract from Isaac's achievements of what he's been able to do, but now it's Liam's turn to shine, and it's very much showing that his return to racing balls has worked wonders, and that he has indeed not lost any confidence. Yes, we were all very hard on him at the beginning of the season, myself included, but he has risen to the occasion and proven himself to be yet again one of the winners, and keeping Racing Bulls in the hunt for P6 himself, albeit a little bit further behind Aston Martin and Sauber. They are still in very much the midfield hunt, and he managed to keep Verstappen behind him on a set of soft tyres. That's crazy. That is something that is certainly commendable, and I know that he might struggle to win certain fans over, because he's very much had the Esteban Ocon effect in picking battles with very, very popular drivers at the very beginnings of his career, and not being immediately repentant. So therefore, you are going to rub people up the wrong way, understandably. So this is a big battle for him to try and win. And he may not be here to make friends, but he is certainly making places. And now we get to the mess section, and for ages I was agonising about where to put Ferrari, and in particular Charles Leclerc, because for the longest time, nigh on half the race distance, it looked likely Charles Leclerc was going to be pulling off one of the biggest coups of the season, given where Ferrari are in relation to McLaren. Because for those first 30-ish laps or so, he was convincingly ahead of Piastri by 2 to 3 seconds, and ultimately, that's just enough for an undercut salvation insurance policy, and also being able to just, well, control and dictate the pace on his terms. But that didn't come easily to him, because we've got to remember what he was saying in Q3. He had to effectively panel beat Ferrari into submission, into doing exactly what he wanted to do in relation in being put out in certain traffic where he is out one of the first ones to be doing his final lap. And it's becoming very clear now that at Ferrari, the LEC moniker, the suffix for Charles Leclerc, it doesn't stand for Leclerc, it stands for lecture. Yeah, too many words of wisdom to count this weekend. But again, we must acknowledge how Leclerc was able to edge clear through the opening stint. But then he reported something strange in the chassis after one of his stops, and the pace just collapsed. So maybe it wasn't the strategy solely responsible for his downfall? Although the George Russell Detective Service has claimed shenanigans regarding ride heights being changed, which might have made the car illegal in his views. But regardless, Piastri and Russell did sweep by, and the latter got the brunt of his anger to the trouble of a 5-second penalty, which didn't make any difference to Alonso behind, so, Charles could vent without any repercussions. And then we got to look about what happened with Lewis Hamilton. Him running an alternate strategy, him starting from very much near the back of the grid. He managed to make up some places, but nowhere near as much as they were able to do in Spa. And the only major thing of note during the race is that yet again, like last year, he got in a tangle with Max Verstappen, albeit with a little bit less consequence in that, they both went wide at turn 4. It was quite spicy at that corner especially, but there was no car flying in the air or anything. And the two men weren't, batting each other in their head afterwards. They were very much circumspect, because they shouldn't really be fighting for 12th. Oh, and as for those words he was saying on Saturday about how he was useless and Ferrari should change driver, I paid no mind to that. I ignored that, because it was a case of how drivers can be fueled with adrenaline in terms of anger? I think he was filled with adrenaline and frustration at that time, and it then manifested into sadness. So I just tuned it out. I ignored it. I'm just like, yeah, okay, Lewis, I know you're sad, but I don't think you really mean that. Ferrari aren't going to replace him, let's be real. And I also keep Ferrari in the mess section instead of pushing them down to the losers, because they still scored a fair few points. They only scored a few less than Mercedes. I think they got 12 with Charles to Mercedes 16, with the 1 from Kimi and then the 15 from George. So it wasn't a total disaster. They weren't going to be figuring them at McLaren, and for a while, when the car was actually working properly, the Ferrari just came on song, and it was looking really, really solid. And had they not been a chassis issue, which resulted in what happened near the end of the race, then Leclerc could at the very least gotten in a good podium place, or maybe ideally split the McLarens. I also thought about putting Kimi in the winner's pen, but I'm quite sure the Italian would have wanted more than a single point for his troubles to be put there, so yeah, I still think it's better than nothing, because a month ago, he would have bitten your hand off for 10th. Because for the longest time, several weeks after the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix, Kimi's just looked lost. No clue what's been happening with his troubles with the car, the upgrade path of the W16 itself not really giving him any favours, and then there was talk about his contract being moved to Alpine or something, question marks about his future despite the higher-ups in the technical team really rating him. There was a lot of uncertainty. So now, hopefully, this streak has now been put to bed right before the summer break, where he can say, okay, at least I scored a point. So now he has 64 of them. And 64 is a very nice number. It is bigger than 63. Especially him coming back from near the middle pack of the bottom 10 to now get into the top 10. and having a few tussles with the likes of Max Verstappen, and him being able to fend off the likes of Isack Hadjar and Lewis Hamilton. There was a lot of battles with him. He was not like near the pack and got lucky. He did have to rise back up the field, and the Mercedes was back on his song. And also, let's not forget, in the midst of all of this, there was a very good example of tyre management that Esteban Ocon, a much more experienced driver, wasn't able to pull off with 55 laps. Kimi was able to keep his tyres going for 48 laps, and therefore be able to change, and therefore keep that point. And he admits, though, that it felt like never-ending, that particular stint. But nevertheless, he was able to do it, pull it off. And I know it's small potatoes, but as I say time and time again, at least he has some potatoes to share with us. And indeed, he was able to fend off Isack Hadjar only a few tenths behind the Italian, and I feel bad for Isack incredibly, I really do, because a Q3 start after a couple of races where he's not had the best of times, this was a pretty good return or a rebound, albeit a bit of a small one, behind his teammate. But then what happened near the start of the race was really, really unfortunate and tragic. Blob of gravel right on his finger, on his left hand. I saw the video and it was like, oh, that's gotta hurt, because that was coming at him at about 100 miles an hour. That is going to sting for a long time. For him to be able to continue, that is some guts right there. They've mirrored the same strategy, I think, as they did with Lawson. He did close in, he finished 11th, so that's certainly respectable. So for that, and him being able to survive the agony of just caning your finger when you need everything to not hurt, that is very much props to him and respect. He's tough. And I think that maybe being able to keep in touch with Antonelli and keep Hamilton behind him, his idol, will certainly ease the pain, although I think painkillers will do a better job in the long run. But hey, at least he's got some time to recover. He'll be fighting fit by the time we get to the Dutch Grand Prix, so I do have to give Isack my dues in that I give him credit for not just calling it a day, just putting that thing on ice immediately. He kept going. Good on him. But you do have to also accept the fact that in terms of the battle between he and his teammate, Lawson is catching up very, very quickly. But yeah, feel better soon, mate. And I think you know where we were going to go next, because the losers start off with Red Bull, with Verstappen describing his weekend as one of those having just no grip, and the data agree. Yeah, it wasn't the crash out we were expecting that we got last year, but Max kind of just rolling with it, something that is a little bit out of character. But at the same time, you might be thinking that he has just started to get his head down and try and fix Red Bull's problem in the long term, and just accepting that he might struggle to win a Grand Prix this season. And that is a really big surprise, given the fact that it's been really dominating from him, getting dozens and dozens of victories the last 3 years. For him to now probably be lucky to get in the top 5, let alone win a race, that's wild, man. But at least in some sense, it's reassuring that he's not flying off the handle, he's not getting angry, he's aware of the task, he understands the assignment and what have you, all the other Gen Z memery type things. But it is still a little bit jarring to see that at some point in Q1, it looked likely that Verstappen might have crashed out in some way. 11th and then Yuki 16th. And Sonoda, my god. I mean, like, he was closer to Max than ever, not that far at all, but he still went out in Q1. That is something to remember, is that the car is very much coming to Yuki, but the car is falling behind everybody else. So therefore, it means that he's exactly where he was just a few races ago when he was struggling with the car. The guy can't get a break. But you've got to admit that with Verstappen trying his best to make a couple of places at the start, we saw overtakes that were godly and reminding us of his skill. Being able to overtake at the chicane, I think twice, 3 times over the race, that's nuts. I didn't see anyone else do that. That is really a hallmark of his general skill, that he can make the RB21 do something, albeit not get a podium. And then with Yuki, it was compounded where he had a pit lane start. He then, I think, damaged his front wing with Hülkenberg, which meant that he lost downforce, so he couldn't really make up places. So Red Bull just had a Mardy of it. But they weren't kicking and screaming like they would have done in the Hornet era. They were just realizing that, yeah, no, we suck right now, and we got to stop that from happening for, a long time. This is at least a more pragmatic Red Bull. It may not be a spunky, sexy Red Bull, but it's the Red Bull that we need right now. One that is doing a little bit of soul searching. And hey, at least Verstappen's able to be honest, and he's not railing against the system. And you know how I touched upon Nico Hülkenberg early in the video? Because, yeah, let's be honest, Nico was a loser today, and it was compounded by the fact that today was Gabi's day, plain and simple. He got 5 seconds added to his time, so that really didn't help him. He did have a little bit of a fight back, but then ultimately it fell back towards 13th place. It was okay, it wasn't a disastrous weekend, but you've really got to look at this in contrast with his younger teammate, a rookie teammate, where it was faultless Q3, again, 8 points, not the podium that we got from Nico. I think, honestly, Hulkenberg doesn't really care anymore what happens this season. He gets his podium. Fine. This is great. Because I think he, like Leclerc, was complaining that something felt completely different about his car after one of his stops, which meant that he was really up against it, and therefore it compounded what was going on with this weekend. So that, again, not much else to be said, honestly. It was okay, but it was certainly nothing close to what Gabi was able to do, a P6, fighting an Aston Martin and a Red Bull convincingly. But yeah, Sauber, swings and roundabouts. And with Williams, this really shouldn't have been a surprise. We all knew this was going to be a weak weekend for them. The drivers had accepted it too. So they both started on the soft tyres. This was a bit of a last resort Hail Mary sort of a thing, and it did work for a while, with Carlos taking up a few places, Alex made a couple, but then traffic locked them in. The tyres would understandably fall away, and that was it, really. So the important thing with a soft tyre start is that you make up places, you don't get stuck in traffic. But then, unfortunately, they got stuck in traffic because due to the fact the car has much less downforce than some of its competitors. And then Sainz had a tangle with Gasly, that sustained some damage, cost him some time, meant that he could only get 14th, and then even then Sainz was saying that maybe 13th was the best the car could come up with, which admittedly was not that inaccurate. And then Alex Albon qualifying last and then making up a few places. It just felt like, yeah, the statement he said in that nothing's been working couldn't be more true. But I think the team were not really surprised about this at all, so it really shouldn't be a shocker to any Williams fans. It was just a case of grinning and bearing it. But what they didn't expect was Aston Martin to score that many points, and now their place on 5th looks really, really vulnerable. And speaking of constructors, Haas are a team in which they are rapidly falling away from the midfield and into the clutches of Alpine in fighting to not be last. Especially galling since Behrman's promising qualifying imploded once floor damage robbed him of decent grip. He couldn't even appease David Croft and get P11 for the X time in a row. In fact, he didn't even finish the race, and I say once again, the upgrades with Haas are working, but the fact remains is that the execution in regards to qualifying, they're just not coming up with the goods to make the drivers' lives a little bit easier. Really, really compounds Behrman's mistake in practice at Silverstone, where he did get into Q3. That could have been at least a 7th or an 8th place, with his experience a little bit more in the rain, the only surviving rookie that weekend, but Haas are dropping the ball in key areas where they really shouldn't be, and their competitors are simply not doing that, and having weekends where they score big. And Esteban Ocon, I mean, my goodness, he was just a sitting duck. It just meant that all of the hard work that he did at the beginning of that long stint was completely undone in the last 10 laps or so, where he was completely losing traction and losing time. At least Io Komatsu admitted their mistakes, that everything just went wrong. The strategy was wrong, the execution was wrong, it was just a bad day. I do feel this team has the potential to do more, and I know they are trying their best, but it just feels like it's just not coming together at the same time in all respects. It's just really not syncing correctly, you know? Especially with Oliver, right? I think he's had to bear the brunt of all of the technical maladies as well, and yet again, he got damaged, he was losing so much time, they boxed to retire their car. Ugh, I feel bad for them, and I really do. I do feel bad for Ocon as well, but at least he can be smiling a little bit in that, hey, at least I'm not at Alpine at the moment, because what were they doing? This is not a power circuit. So therefore Alpine might have been able to at least score a little bit more likely than they did at Spa, which is definitely is a power circuit, and then Pierre got a 10th place there. But what did they go and do? They finished 18th and 19th, with Franco being the faster of the two. Or certainly, the more fortunate of the two. They didn't get a chance to score some points? How? Well, it does ultimately turn out execution was very much the weakness, the pit stops especially. And Pierre Gasly getting a time penalty was Sainz and all. Because according to Gasly, his hard-medium plan looked like it could have yielded some smiles for the team until that slow stop really hindered his progression. And Colapinto looked set to emulate the top 10's pace in clean air. He felt pretty good. But then he had 2 sticky pit stops, which cost him even more time, arguably, than Gasly had with his maladies. And that meant he couldn't do more better, the Argentinian, than 18th. So now we're getting into a state of damage limitation where Flavio Briatore say, even though they started the year saying they were going to give it all the beans and try and get 5th place in the constructors to get a little bit more money to maybe solve a team. But in any case, no, this is very much damage limitation, realizing the car is absolutely garbage. Either that or it's not progressing fast enough than the other people around them. I don't think it's going to explain away in the eyes of the public. It just feels like this car and team are incredibly weak, and these two drivers, both Pierre and Franco, are just doing all they can, but they are met with obstacles right, left, up, down, pit lane, what have you, everywhere. So therefore, I really think that Franco should be given a little bit of slack here, as should Pierre, because I bet he's seething right now. But in the midst of all of these comments, and I think this might give Flavio a bit of a relief in the long term, is that Franco is starting to get a handle of the car as well as the team. It may be, again, small potatoes, but it is something. The Argentinian is improving, but the car is rapidly falling behind everyone else, so you don't really actually see that. It's very much like Mick Schumacher toward the end of 2022. He was progressing, but the car wasn't, and everyone else was. So what good could he do to make up for the mistakes he made at the start of the season? Who is the complete opposite right now? F3's newly minted champion Rafael Camara, and I had a chat with him last week before he wrapped up the title with a round to spare, something that has not happened since the days of George Russell. To get to know the F3 champion a little bit more, watch my interview with him right after this video.